All art is political. So that might shock you to hear that, because you might think of political as Democrats and Republicans, or don't be political, meaning like don't talk about something I don't want to talk about. That's not what I mean. Political, you should think more like office politics. And if you've ever seen the show The Office, you understand political is a word to mean power. And that's something humans have thought about since the beginning of art. Take prehistoric art. It wasn't really power against other people, because they were usually in communities that had no hierarchy, but it was power against nature. And so many of these installations, for lack of a better word, in prehistory were about power, and sometimes the awe of the power of nature. And that's political. Some of the first art that comes from after that period, when we are settled, is a different kind of expression of power. It's about land ownership. So this is from prehistoric Japan during the Jomon period. So like 2000 BC, in the ground, so that they could say, this is my land and that is your land. And basically that is the political nature of communities coming together and making themselves different than the community over there. Another really important part of historic art and the political nature of historic art is when you see funerary art. There's two reasons that it's very political. One, it's this sort of idea that whatever good stuff you have, whatever hierarchy you're benefiting from now, you want to make sure you have that in the afterlife. And this is Master Li's bell. It's a bell that was from ancient China that was found in a tomb. The other reason this is political is that the inscription here reads, it's for a son who received his job, which was the hereditary role of overseeing fishery, from his father. And he's so thankful for this hereditary system. And so much of art is about this being thankful. So another political aspect of art is the relationship between power and faith. This is the ziggurat of one of the first standing temples. But it wasn't just about religion, right? It was about these powerful rulers who were thanking the gods for their power and ensuring that all people see how powerful they are. Another way that we see ancient art showing how art is political is that art is often associated with trade. See, this art that's on a trade seal, you would stamp your items in the ancient Indus Valley with your seal. So art is connected to this idea of identity and power. Take the Greeks, who were obsessed with what makes someone Greek and not Greek. So these are kouros, or the idealized male Greek. And for them, this was not just the ideal of beauty. It was the idea that this man, in some ways metaphorically, but would basically continue the line of being Greek, of being part of the demos, the city, the people. And they were very obsessed, had a word, barbarian, for people who were not Greek, because when they spoke, it sounded like bar, 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 bar. And they really wanted to police what is Greek and what is not. And they created a lot of art to support that politics, this idea that our polis, our people, are one thing, and those people over there are another thing. Look, they even dress different. They live differently. They are different. And that is a very political part of art, identifying what identity is, who is our people, and who are those people. And to go back to The Office, think about all of the interpersonal relationships. You know, a lot of the things I've talked about are things that Michael might have tried to do, right? Like he wants to show how smart he is. And then you see all of the other people who are trying to kind of put up with Michael and create their own barriers, their own boundaries. So sometimes if you kind of try to think of political as a way to think about people in relationship to each other, I think you'll understand it more. Now, portraits are super political, right? Because they're basically standing in for that political figure. This is Augustus, the first emperor of the Roman Empire. And he fought to get this, and he wants everyone to know it. But There are other things that we might not think of as political, and decorative arts are a good example. These are migration period jewels, basically. That was a fibula, so it's basically like a big safety clip, and this is a belt buckle. In the same way, the Met Gala is political. It's about the kinds of choices that culture is making, and this is really conspicuous consumption. These are the wealthiest people of that time, and they wanted to show you. They wanted to show you their wealth and power. And one of the most obvious ways in which you know that art is political is the fact it is historically destroyed when politics change. So this is an image of the iconoclasm that happened in Europe, and you can see back there's a church with different items that are being thrown on the ground. And what's happening here is the Protestant Reformation. So there's lots of iconoclasms. You see iconoclasm in ancient Egypt. Next ruler comes in, just rips out the name of the previous ruler, so he has trouble in the afterlife. You see smaller iconoclasms, just like even at the family unit, right? People moved into the house, they took over hereditary land, and they changed everything. Iconoclasm has occurred really since art was being produced. This iconoclasm was a huge one. So in 1500, they're finishing the Sistine Chapel. By 1512, it is done. And right around then, the Catholic Church had been taking so much money from people, partly to pay for the Sistine Chapel, but there was other corruptions at all sorts of levels in the Catholic Church. And that is when the Protestant Reformation happens. Martin Luther kicks it off in 1517 with his 95 Theses, basically breaking with the Catholic Church and the idea that you need a priest to connect you to faith. At that same moment, he also says you don't need all this stuff. And so all liturgical art gets basically null and void. It doesn't matter. And people could just leave it, right? But they choose to break it because it's symbolic. Art is symbolic of the power of the Catholic Church. It is political. And so they destroy it. And you see it particularly in England and the Netherlands, but in other places as well. There is a real break with the Catholic Church. And then what happens is the Catholic Church says, okay, you're destroying those icons. We're going to change icons to make them more human. And so what we see is art like Caravaggio. It takes place oftentimes in settings that might look very much like the life of the people in Italy who would be looking at this. So it was like regular old guys are seeing the calling of St. Matthew. It was in our own life. It would be as if like you go into a religious store now and you see Jesus playing basketball. It's sort of like that. But then it also has the lighting of a horror movie. You could add that spooky music. This is the same kind of thing. He purposely makes it so that it feels very emotional. Sometimes it's called tenebrism. Basically, this artwork is like signed the power of the Catholic Church. And that's why it's political. It's about trying to keep those souls, the ones that we have, keeping them with us. And sometimes when you hear art is political and you're like, no, of course not, it's because you don't know the backstory about art. And that's what makes it sometimes hard to make sense of that statement, all art is political, because so much of what is politics of it is backstory. And it's not always easy. Like this one is easy, right? It's an emperor. And this one's probably pretty easy. This is this is the source for the dollar bill. That's George Washington. This one is probably pretty easy, right? But let's also kind of unpack this one. It is Washington crossing the Delaware. But it is political not just because it's telling a literal political story of the creation of our nation. It's also political in why they made it. So this is explicitly political, right? It's George Washington with his men crossing the Delaware. It is just political. I don't think anybody would doubt that this is political. It is a politician and a story about a politician. Except for this is a great example of how context helps you understand how inherently political it is. First of all, notice how it's all of these figures, they're all looking in the direction, right? We're all watching the progress. This is in the same vein as that Caravaggio, The Calling of St. Matthew. It is about, it's about telling a story in a really emotional way and getting people to feel for this scene. And that is a huge way that art is often political, trying to make a point of view and encourage people to all agree with this by really honing in on a singular message visually. So like you don't have any dissent. It's just, yeah, that guy's a hero. Look at him go. The other reason this is political is because at the beginning of this new nation, so many of these people were from established nations like the Netherlands and England. And in their own nations, they had a lot of art that was telling the stories of their nations, and particularly portraits and history paintings. History paintings are any painting that has a lot of figures telling some story. And this is basically saying, we are a real nation, and so we have our own stories and we have our own lore. We don't need yours. And so it's even beyond just the literal story here. It's the politics of making a nation and making our own ethos. This is the rise and the moving of human beings. There's all of this backstory to this. And of course, she is all about conspicuous consumption, which is inherently political. It's making art with money that's been taxed by. A decade after America comes into fruition, it's created its own visual ethos of who our new nation is. We have the French Revolution. And before we get to the French Revolution and the visual culture about that, this is another great example of all those things that you think of like cups and plates. They're not political. There are so many political aspects to every sort of visual culture that we have, and Versailles is a great example. They basically rebuilt this hunting lodge in a palace, and they are trying their best to bankrupt the country under the reign of Marie Antoinette, though it really was a whole variety of things. She's really not to blame. She was just a symptom, her and her husband just doing their best to seem like royalty, keep up with the Joneses, like the Austrians and the English. And so and the Dutch, who had no royalty basically, but definitely had a lot of wealth. So you have all that conspicuous consumption at the wealthy class, right? And that's definitely about politics and about sort of showing how wealthy you are. But actually, at the same time, you have all of this other kinds of visual culture. And this is really the rise of political cartoons. You have many more people having the ability to print things, lithographies taking off. You already had printing presses for a long time. And so this is Marie Antoinette. So you see this rise in popular culture. People are consuming all sorts of visuals, including caricatures, like this caricature of Marie Antoinette. And this is one of the tamer ones. There are so many more. Woo! Lots of out there portraits of Marie Antoinette. She was basically the scapegoat for the French Revolution. She was a foreigner. She was, ostentatious. She was a foreigner. And so they made all of these sorts of, and I wouldn't call them political cartoons, they're really caricatures, to try to get the people to see how awful the aristocracy is and overthrow them. This is where art is political is true. All art is political, but that's the politics that I was starting out talking about, interpersonal power, that kind of stuff. This art is overtly political in the way that you probably think of the term. This is basically about overthrowing a government. And so this is another kind of political art, a subset of art, propaganda, because its purpose is to sway, and it's not going to do anything but try to get you to see that she is an animal. So we have this kind of political art. It does result in of Marie Antoinette and her husband. But then there's other kinds of political art as well. So I'm going to kind of jump forward in history. So part of the reason that the American colonies became a nation and the French Revolution is the Enlightenment. It's this idea that people should create knowledge. And modern art comes out of that. Certainly it's a couple hundred years later. But we are looking at splatter paintings and abstraction. And you probably think this must be Jackson Pollock. It's actually not. It's Janet Sobel. And this is not either. This is Lee Krasner. And one of the most political things about art that comes out of the late 19th century is this idea of a genius, or an artist who is so good and their style is so cutting edge. That is absolutely political. This idea that you're putting your stake in the ground and you're using this as self-exploration, what's the word? Expression. You're using this as self-expression. And so who is considered a genius artist also became very political. So Jackson Pollock actually saw the work of Janet Sobel, and that's where he likely got his idea of drip painting. He became wildly famous, and he was married to Lee Krasner, and a lot of his styles now people are like, oh, it was probably from Lee Krasner, but he became famous. And that really is an important part of the 20th century. Who became famous as an artist and who didn't? And that was incredibly political. And it was part of the art establishment as art became a very valuable commodity. And so people like Janet Sobel, who were home with kids, didn't get a name for themselves. Luckily, by the end of the 20th century, people like Lee Krasner were getting names for themselves, because the other really political thing about art is that it keeps up with the times. And by the end of the 20th century, much more diversity was expected in art, just as it is in society. So women like Lee Krasner really started to get the attention they so much deserved. And so their art was starting to get this kind of applause. The other thing is, so other people started getting acclaim in the 20th century. And to go back to this image of Washington crossing the Delaware, so it is almost like in the 20th century, and actually in every era, artists are there to help the country understand who they are. That is part of the life of an artist. And so we get artists who are trying to really push against what it means to be American. And so here we have Colescott. And Robert Colescott was an African-American artist who wanted to really confront these kinds of stereotypes we had about our country and what was American. So here we see his artwork of Washington crossing the Delaware. And it was pretty shocking in the end of the 20th century to see Washington as a black man, but he meant to shock. And so I think also when you think all art is political, you assume that it means that it is overtly political. Like this is an overtly political artwork, just like its original source was an overtly political artwork. But it isn't, right? We just looked at a million different kinds of artworks that are political. Some of them, like this one, though, the politics is right on the surface, and sometimes the politics is underlying the artwork. So if you've watched all of this and you're like, okay, I kind of get what you're talking about, you mean that all of these things tell a political story or are connected to politics of the era or the era they're in, but not all art is political, like this banana taped to the wall is not political. I would say to you, the next thing you might say is, it took no effort, or it's ugly, or it means nothing, or there's no skill there. And I would tell you that all four of those things you said proves you actually understand that art is political. Art is about labor at its essence. And so in capitalism, we kind of see value based on how much labor is in it, or how much the market will pay for it. When there is a lot of labor in it and the market will pay that much, it seems right. When it seems like somebody is cheating the system, so they're not putting in that much labor and then they get paid a lot, it feels like we are being cheated, right? And that's why you understand inherently that art is political, because you understand the politics of capitalism by just saying this feels unfair. Now, of course, you're also saying that his intellectual property isn't worth it, right? Like that his idea isn't worth it. And I would say I don't like Maurizio Cattelan. I think his ideas are facile. They're not very interesting to me. But I think it is proof that art is political, because we all inherently see this as unfair. We get that unfairness, and so we get that it's political. We just don't know how to articulate that. And what we're really feeling is actually how unfair the art system is. And that's okay. So this is why I talk about art on all of my channels. It's because it's really important to help you be a citizen of the world, to understand the visual imagery that is both implicitly and explicitly political.